Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. So everyone, today I have with me Mary Tutaev, who is someone who spends a lot of time discussing and supporting people processing grief of various forms. She runs something called a death cafe, which is getting a lot of interest. And I invited her onto the podcast because Mary has herself been through MECFS, which is something I didn't know when I invited her. But I invited her because I wanted to explore the whole idea of the amount of grieving that we can do with a condition like this, grieving our former selves, grieving our relationships, perhaps grieving lost life opportunities. So I'd love to therefore speak with Mary about it, because she spends a lot of time reflecting on grief as a process and its implications for our lives. So Mary, a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Anna.
So Mary, do you want to tell the audience very briefly about your own experience with MECFS just before we start talking about grief?
Okay, so I was 22 and a student, and I was studying performing arts, so quite an energetic subject to be studying and specialising in dance, and started just to feel very, very tired and not well, and went to the doctor. And unfortunately in those days, so we're talking 40 years ago, not much was known about ME, as much as now. And I was just told, you've got a virus, full stop. Yeah, which is a really useful blanket sentence, isn't it, to issue somebody. And so felt pretty much on my own, and shared a house with 3 other energetic girls who were noticing that I was sleeping all the time. My hair was coming out in the basin. I wasn't eating properly, but none of us knew what was going on. So I came back to Bristol and luckily found a wonderful female doctor, young doctor, who said, one day this is going to be taken seriously, and began to explain to me the implications of what was happening to me. And so it was a real journey of learning how to be young and previously energetic, and now feeling not young and no energy. And yeah, I was thinking about it. There was a lot of grief, because especially when you're young, you might not have a lot of experience of grief and how to deal with it, because as you get older, it's inevitable that grief visits you, whether you like it or not. So that's my story, really.
Mary, if you could go back to that younger self and give her some words of wisdom about the process of the things she was losing and how to process that loss, what would you now say to her based on all your experience?
I think to accept all the different colours of grief, because grief, it's often depicted, isn't it, in films or stories as almost one-dimensional. And it's so not that, because it's a continual ebbing and flowing. It's a continual looking at the past, but feeling where you are now, and maybe worrying about the future. So I think I would have said, don't try to be what you were, but recognize the grief of that, because you are losing something, but see how you can be creative with where you are now. And that's very black and white, because you have to go through so many stages of grief to do that. But I really think, Anna, that the more people I talk to, the more I realise that if you can, it requires an adaptation. It requires you to recognise all the feelings of grief, which sometimes they're brandished as negative. Again, I see them as illuminating because they are telling you something. So you might be angry. Grief can contain a lot of rage and a lot of passion, and grief can contain a lot of confusion and also coping with other people's reactions to your grief and to where you are. Some people get very uncomfortable. They want to quick fix you, or they don't really want to acknowledge what you're going through, because then it might make them have to self-reflect, with their own, where they are in their own lives. So I think it would be to learn how to adapt and to be kind to yourself. That's so important. So that on days when you feel absolutely exhausted, I would fight through that when I was younger and make myself, no, I've got to do exactly what I did last year, and then end up doubly exhausted. So what I've learned is that if you're having an exhausting day, either mentally or physically, if you can, slow down. Now, that's easier than said, because if you're a professional, or you're a mother or a father, you can't necessarily slow down, but maybe you can let other people know that you're having a bad day. Because I also think there's a kind of self-shaming where you feel, I shouldn't be asking for help. But actually, on those bad days, that's exactly when you need a bit more support and self-kindness.
That's quite challenging for people with long-term chronic illness, because often the people around them are just so exhausted by being around and often can't understand, particularly because it's complex and it fluctuates. But from what I'm hearing you say as well, Mary, there's an analogy there to grief as well, isn't it? Because it seems that you're saying that grief is a fluctuating process, and grief itself demands a certain amount of self-compassion and changes your relationships with other people. So I was just wondering, could you reflect on that a bit more, about the process of grieving, the phases of grieving, the way it changes, and kind of the best ways that people can manage those shifting states of grief? Subjectively, it can be very different, even for people grieving the same, death. If we turn to literal death and we think about the loss of a parent in a family, my experience is that each member of the family has a very different mode of grieving, because their relationship with that person was different and alive, changing, sometimes very painful, sometimes not. But it seems that there's no rule book for grief. It seems that it moves around, it's got an energy, and it can be unpredictable. So, I mean, I believe there are recognized stages of grief, but that they're not like literally consecutive stages. They're dimensions of grief that can tumble over each other in the lived experience. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so I've got mixed feelings about that, because I'm self-help books and formulas are great in one way, but they also cage up people unintentionally in another way. Because if you take the known stages of grief, where it's supposed to be, shock, anger, depression, bartering, so on and so on, it kind of implies that they're very neat compartments and that you'll go from one to the other. And then people are shocked when they say to me, but I didn't go through the stages that way. I went forwards and backwards and sideways. So my feelings is, of course, read up, and of course find a support group or support books that resonate with you. But don't be surprised or disappointed in yourself if you don't go from A to B to C, because grief goes forwards and backwards and sideways. And you can think, I've gone through that stage of grief, I'm not going to do the bartering anymore. And then then grief decides to visit you one day, and that little bartering voice comes out, if I do this, or if I did this, can I get that person back, or can I get myself back? And anger visits you all the time. Anger of what's happening to your body or what's happening to someone you love. So for me, Anna, it's not a linear path.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it comes out as a kind of, yes, you can recognize key emotional states that you can associate with the process, but it's going to come in a tumult at different times. And of course, there are those moments when you're grieving when it's hilarious, it's funny, where you forget what you've lost, and then you remember again, and then it comes in again, or whatever. I mean, it's very unpredictable, and there are no rules or straight lines, although I think I discerned a particular central piece of advice in what you were saying earlier, which is the importance of really being kind to yourself and allowing the process.
So important. It's so important, because there are going to be days, and again, especially with what you're specialising in, the brain fog, which I get, and I have to work through, and I have to recognise. And I found that really distressing at first, that, you expect me to deal with grief, and my brain's so foggy that I don't know what I'm supposed to feel, because I can barely function or articulate what I am feeling. And then there's a grief in that. There's a grief in losing the clarity, because so often with illness or grief, your clarity, because you're disorientated at first, you're having to learn how to be a new version of yourself. And the same with death and grief, that you hardly recognize yourself in the beginning, because there's so much shock to navigate. And yet you're supposed to, as an adult, deal with all the practical things in your life. And that's where kindness is important. So if you were used to entertaining, or you were used to socializing, and you suddenly find, I can't do that, or I don't want to, instead of beating yourself up and saying, well, I'm failing, or look at me, it's like, well, there's a reason why you need to slow down and be kind to yourself, and also try and surround yourself with people who can handle where you are. I used to recognize the people that were uncomfortable and used to say cliches, not because they were unkind, but because they couldn't deal with it. Time will heal, or as one door closes, another will open, and all that, which is well meant, but it really isn't helpful, because it negates what you're feeling. And I think that people want to be heard, most of all when a person is grieving, either for themselves or for someone they love. They just want their story heard.
Anything short of that's a failure of recognition, isn't it? And that's in itself a very difficult thing to deal with, because, as you say, in those moments, what you most want is some attunement, some intimacy, some ability from someone to be comfortable with your discomfort, or comfortable enough with your discomfort that they can be empathic and hold a space for you.
And not necessarily fix you, because, again, some people are so uncomfortable that they want to fix you. So they'll suggest things quickly. And actually, you might not want to be fixed, because you don't know where your journey's going anyway. How can I say, yes, fix me, when I don't know what's happening? But I'd like you to listen. And that in itself is the gift, isn't it? Of somebody just listening.
Yeah, just really being there. So are there any insights that come out of the Death Cafe process? Actually, do you want to explain what the Death Cafe is, to those who don't know what a Death Cafe is, and then kind of the things you do, and then the sort of insights that come out of the discussions in the Death Cafe?
Okay, thank you. So Death Cafe is a movement that was started by an amazing guy who sadly he has died now, but he wanted to provide a safe place, but informal, where you could get together and discuss anything that either puzzled you or fascinated you about death and death issues, but in a very relaxed way. So the cafe bit is, bring a cup of tea, bring cake, bring toast, so that it's not stiff. It's not, it's not intimidating. And within that session, it's totally organic. So although you have a facilitator, they don't prepare the session. They open it out and say, okay, what is it that's on people's minds today? And it can range from really practical issues to philosophical, scientific ideas to really vulnerable stories. And what I've learned is that people sometimes find it easier to speak about their heart with a group of strangers because they feel they must protect their family. They don't want to hurt them. They don't want arguments. They feel slightly embarrassed. But with strangers, you've got none of that to worry about. So we've had people who have had pent-up stories that have been inside their minds and bodies for maybe 50, 40 years. And they say, this is the first time that I've been able to talk about my grandmother's death when I was 5. And here I am, 55, and I've not been able to talk about it. And then we get young people, students who sadly maybe have lost a parent young or just quizzical. And I see this wonderful exchange between the age groups and the experiences. And some people who haven't been ask me, is it depressing? The idea feels like it could be depressing, but I have never witnessed a depressing death cafe. There's usually a collective sigh of, oh, how amazing to be able to share this stuff. Because again, we're not comfortable in general society talking about death. It's the quickest way to shut down a conversation often is to say, oh, I've thought about this, about death, or thought about that. People are uncomfortable. And also it's in the modern society, it's quite packaged separately from your own life. In the past, it was part of everyday life. And you were involved in the process or in the funeral. And so there's this slight separation that people are uncomfortable with. So I hope I kind of painted a positive idea of what a death cafe is.
Definitely. And I think what's really beautiful in it from where I'm sitting is it's really fundamentally human, isn't it, to actually face death and dying. I mean, it's a given about our humanity. We don't live forever in this body. Whatever we believe about what happens after death in this life, we have ultimately a final death, ours, a physical death, the death of this body, but also lots of little mini deaths where we're letting parts of ourselves go. And that's an important process of maturation. It's an important part of evolution to be able to let things go. But there is something really beautiful about the idea of coming together and actually acknowledging in a shared space the process of death and dying, what it means to let go, and to acknowledge all the emotions that come up in that process.
Yes, and you're so right about the mini deaths, because we are constantly, just through living, facing mini deaths. In relationships, in professional capacities, in our illnesses that we face, so many ways. And it's important to recognise that. And why I harp on about creativity, and I know that kind of unsettles people, because how can you be creative if you're suffering? Well, I actually think you can be creative, but it's a different version of creative, if that makes sense.
Oh, I want you to say more about this, because I'm sensing here that there might be a practical tool for people processing their grief, even in illness, processing their grief about their former lives, say, or their present relational difficulties or whatever. when you talk about creativity, I'm sensing there's a method or an approach or a path here that allows people to really explore. So I'd love you to say more about that.
So observing other people and myself, when you get a diagnosis, especially with illness, it's easy to start believing that that's the definition of yourself, because people respond to you usually saying, how is your illness, or how are you? When you go to see doctors, if you're lucky and you get a holistic doctor, that's wonderful. But sometimes you'll get a technical doctor that just wants to deal with the bit of you that's ill. And then you come home and you can believe that's the definition of me. And I try and encourage people to not run away from that, because that's important that you acknowledge what you're going through. But instead of saying, okay, I'm finished because of that diagnosis, what can you do within that diagnosis? So if it's a day when not a bad day, if it's a bad day, you have to almost get primitive, keep yourself warm, nourish yourself, look after yourself. But if it's a day that's slightly better than that, what can you do? So for me, I couldn't dance anymore. My body just wouldn't let me. So I thought, okay, I had taught chair yoga and chair tai chi. This is interesting, Anna, because I was doing it from the other, the patient becomes the doctor becomes the patient. So I now had to experience, instead of having a strong, fit body and facilitating this class, I now was part of the class. So the Tai Chi was an extension, a replacement of dance, because if you watch Tai Chi, it's so beautiful, it's so flowing. So, okay, my hands work today, my arms work today, so I'll dance with them. So that's a tiny example. I used to love gardening and my body just couldn't dig. But again, I could bring little pots in and plant the seeds inside. I could watch plants growing inside my house and admire gardens. So there was still a connection. So the secret is trying to find a connection that can bridge what you were and where you are, so that you remember that literally that seed is still there.
So you're kind of reiterating a dimension of yourself that used to be a larger part of you. You're not losing the thread of it, but you're allowing it to trickle out in a different way in the world, in a different way in your life, as a mode of self-expression. And that mode of self-expression is a way of expressing a refusal to, okay, you're accepting limitations because you're having to respect what your body's saying at that particular point, but you're refusing to lie down, aren't you? You're refusing to say, I'm just this. You're not giving into an identity level statement about the illness or seeing it as a block. You're seeing it as something that you can flow round, sometimes sneak under, sometimes flow over in subtle and various ways. Is it the same for people when they're grieving people who've gone? I mean, is grief as a process, does creativity really help people in the process of grieving? And if so, what kind of practical creative exercises might work in that way? I mean, poetry is an obvious one. Doodling might be another. I'm just thinking, are there things from people at the Death Cafe that they've found helpful?
There are amazing art projects that are happening. And of course, it's so individual. So for some people, they will need to, or they will believe that that relationship is finished. It's literally gone. And that works for some people. But for other people, there is a belief or recognition that the relationship may have changed. Obviously, the person is gone, but the threads are still there. We don't just stop feeling when somebody dies. And again, what and how? What can you do with those feelings? So some people write letters, and there is a post box. There's somewhere in Britain, there's a post box where you can write this letter and literally post it. There's artwork you can do. There's some people will, I've heard that some people will take the clothes of somebody they loved and either remodel it or wear it as a memory of that person. So you're still carrying on the relationship, but just in a different way.
I think that's a beautiful thought, to take that across to grieving the former self after, or within a chronic illness, because there's a few little methods in there, aren't there? I mean, the idea of putting on clothing is a really powerful symbolic act, a very beautiful thing. But when you talk about keeping the relationship there's a sense, isn't there, in chronic illness where you can almost appreciate that there's a transmutation of the self, that it's actually a kind of turning of a corner, a moving of a season. And while it might be something that, a part of you is going, no, I want to be how I was, there's a real grace in being able to say, okay, how do I embrace this new person? How do I love and keep relationship with that former self while fully embracing what that former self is now becoming right here, right now? And I guess turning, therefore, to writing letters to the former self, perhaps writing letters to the present self, writing letters to the future self, putting on different clothes and imagining different dimensions of experience. Doodling, I think, is a great one for people who are ill, because doodling's an amazing thing, because the doodle itself almost unfolds under the hand. It's not so cognitively controlled, although obviously you can relate to the doodle and you can redirect the doodle and you can think, I'll do circles now, whatever. But doodling is at its most satisfying when you're just going with the flow. And it's a wonderful metaphor, I think, for this kind of thing that you were saying about, you couldn't garden, so you'd find a seed. You couldn't dance, but on the days you could move your arms, you could do something else. It's almost like you're doodling with the self, isn't it?
It is. And that's what's fascinating, isn't it? That by finding some activity, some thought process, you start off with one idea of yourself, and then through the process, you realize another part of yourself, but only by starting that process. And this is really, I'm making it sound so black and white, and it's not an easy process, because sometimes there's so much self-resentment or physical pain that you can't think about starting a process. And if somebody said it to you that day, you'd probably tell them where to go. I think you need to recognize the anger and the rage, because you're almost being forced to become the next version of yourself. And nobody asked you. You're kind of like, well, I didn't want this, but I've got it. And it's I think it's a very therapeutic thing to find some kind of process, some activity that loosens that intensity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And also being able to express the anger in non-damaging ways, I think, is really important, because in my experience of working with clients with MECFS, there are a lot of people who've got unmetabolized anger, unexpressed feelings. They've been prevented or have, for some reason, not been able to express who they are fully, or to express a particular issue or whatever. And that buttoning down takes up so much energy and ultimately isn't healthy for us. And so expressing the anger, the very natural anger that comes when we lose a sense of agency, when we're forced to accept what we don't want to accept, when we confront circumstances that rob us of capacities. And I think anger is such a natural feeling in those circumstances. And it's great to depathologize it and to say, yeah, you can expect it. And actually it is an energy. It's a creative, powerful energy that once you can turn it in a different direction can actually become a form of healing.
Yeah. Anger is often depicted, isn't it, as a negative emotion. And I don't, like you said, if you use it in a constructive way, it's a very powerful force to recognize what you're feeling and to move you on some way. And again, I don't always mean physically moving on. I mean mentally and spiritually moving on. Yeah. And another thing I've noticed, Anna, is comparison grief and self-shaming grief. So I shouldn't feel this because I know somebody else who's got it much worse. Or apology grief, where somebody will start, and this happens at the death cafe sometimes, somebody will go, I'm really sorry, I know this isn't important. And then they'll tell us the most amazing, heartbreaking story of grief. But they've, somewhere in their psyche, they've done a comparison grief that, I shouldn't really be feeling this. And I'm almost apologetic because I'm not as bad as somebody else. And I think comparison in life anyway is negative, because you can never be somebody else and you can never be on somebody else's journey. You can recognize and identify similarities, but as soon as you start doing this comparison thing, you don't actually help yourself. And I'd encourage people not to apologize, not to start the sentence off with I'm sorry, but, because this is your story. This is what you're feeling.
Yeah, and it's really important, isn't it, to show up as we are. I mean, one of the complaints people often make, or one of the sources of grief in the world, is a lack of intimacy. But if we're not showing up as we are, that in and of itself will block our capacity for intimacy. If others can't see us because we're not showing, then we can't be surprised when others don't see us. Because actually, we're hiding from them and we're putting on masks. And yeah, socially we're encouraged to do that. I mean, I think you're right. I think you implied earlier that in the West we're particularly bad with death. We're not very good wailers and hair puller outers at funerals, for example. We don't let it all hang out. And if anyone who does is kind of, regarded as being slightly beyond the pale or embarrassing or whatever. But actually acknowledging these feelings and really showing up as we are and saying, okay, this is right now in this moment, this is what I'm feeling, this is authentically where I am, is such a hugely important aspect of relationship.
And you might actually help other people. This is something I've noticed at the death cafe. People come in a little bit apprehensive. Of course, you don't know what to expect. But one brave person starts a conversation off and the ball starts rolling, and that invites other people. So I think that if you can drop the mask slightly, which we're all encouraged to wear masks as adults, but if you can drop the mask and be brave and say to people, well, actually, I'm feeling this, you're also giving somebody a potential gift that they can think, oh, you feel that too. It's a bonding thing, isn't it? Instead of, it's a very British thing. When you ask somebody how they are, they go, I'm all right. What does that actually mean? Behind that I'm all right, 100 different things. So
what I'm hearing there is the power of sharing, and also the collective sharing. And the recognition in that of the uniqueness of what we all feel, but also the universal dimensions of it. That the moment of recognition of, yes, this is how we feel. It does, we don't all feel the same, but there's a spectrum of responses, and yes, we can recognize in each other responses to processes of loss, death, and dying, illness, and other situations where we're forced to accept painful limitations or removals of things that we value.
And also, Anna, asking for help, because that was something I found hard in the beginning, when I recognized that I couldn't be as independent as I had been previously, I saw it as a weakness at first. And then, thank goodness, something changed in me. And I thought, I need to vocalize that I need some support. And that was very liberating. So not to feel ashamed or feel you're failing if you are going through a phase in your life when you need support, because providing you can find that, and this is a problem at the moment, is accessing, isn't it? Accessing the right support and the continual support, because sadly in so many systems you might be able to explain this to me, Anna. You get this allotted 6 weeks of support in a lot of NHS help systems. You're allocated 6 weeks. Now I understand there's such a waiting list that you know they've got to get on to the next person. But again, I used to kind of semi-argue with my support network. What magically happens then between the 5th week and the 7th week? Why is it deemed that after 6 weeks I'll be okay, when actually the 7th and 8th week, you know, literally I was very puzzled about that. But I did find my voice, and I would recommend to people that find your support network.
I think that's crucial, to find a good support network, but very difficult to do sometimes for people with chronic illness, because even their closest family members can find it hard to show up after a certain amount of time. And I certainly know of people who have ME/CFS who struggle in situations where they are with other people who just don't get it. And if they do get it, they forget. They forget that they're ill, or they get tired of hearing about it. I mean, it is really complicated. I guess one answer is to create like-minded, positive thinking, supportive communities where you can be really, really real, but you're also helped to find ways forward, find ways to healing, not being rushed into it, but just supported to do it lovingly, kindly, with an absolute faith in our capacity to heal. Even if we don't heal physically, there are ways we can heal at a deeper level. And that is, I think, ultimately the life journey that we're all on, is some form of healing, some form of evolution, some form of expansion and deepening, if we're willing to take the invitation, which comes back then to, yes, we do need communities of support. And as you rightly point out, the NHS and other formal services often can't provide it. They haven't got the resources. And also the framework is so limited. The framework of understanding is so limited. My own take on this is that people with chronic fatigue and similarly complex conditions are actually the forerunners of a shift in the paradigm of health. It's very provocative to have so many now with long COVID, millions of people suffering with chronic conditions that contemporary medicine simply has no answers for. We have to look in other places, and those other places are there. There's a whole realm of fantastic health practitioners and others out there working with this. But the deep invitation at the heart of it, I think, is this call to a very profound journey of inner healing and evolution, which in a way, facing up to death, dying and grief, also invites that kind of maturation, doesn't it?
It does. And there's an opportunity to reassess. In illness, it almost forces you, and when you experience the death of somebody, to reassess your life. And part of that is learning to let go of certain tired relationships, maybe, almost like a spring clean of, if someone consistently appears to be bored or disappointed or angry with you because you can't be who you were, then maybe it's time to shift some qualities in that relationship. I mean, I remember certain people that I thought understood what I was going through, but completely didn't, and got quite cross because I messed up their plans for the evening if I cancelled. And it hurts at first. It's natural. It hurts. And then later on you think, hang on here. This was supposed to be a give and take relationship. And I'm sorry if I've messed up your plans. And then the final stage, personally, for me was, I think I need to let this person go if this consistently happens. Because how is this beneficial to my healing or beneficial to them if it just winds them up? So there's a kind of a natural justice in the injustice, that you find out who can cope with where you are and who can't. But remembering that isn't under your power. We have to allow people as well to fail, don't we? It can be quite hard because you're hurt. You can judge a person quite harshly, but they might actually just not either have experienced illness, experienced grief, or want to. So it might not be intentional. It might be just where they are. They can't handle it. But that's a lot when you're feeling not great yourself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It is. But again, we're coming back to mini deaths, aren't we? I mean, at sort of one level, it's the art of letting go. It's the art of understanding that nothing lasts forever, that things change, they evolve, and sometimes they move apart, sometimes they converge, sometimes they deepen, sometimes they die. And this is all part of the great flux of life. And I guess what I'm hearing from our conversation is the importance of self-compassion in that, compassion for others, and that thread of creativity that you mentioned, that important sense of, yes, still holding on to dimensions of the past self that are meaningful to celebrate and hold on to, while also moving forward into new expressions of the self that's emerging.
And becoming, one skill that I think chronically ill people learn is the art of improvisation. And that's really important, that, okay, you can't process or you can't physically do something in one way, but I actually think that we're quite, without patronizing disability, we're quite special people, because we have to improvise and we have to think out of the box. And this is where I wish, Anna, society and government would see what disability and disabled people are capable of and what they could add to society, because I don't feel that is recognised in a positive way, or brought into design, brought into. I've met architectural students who I've questioned, when you're designing, do you make sure the steps are okay, the doors are easy, so that it's an inclusive building? And there might be a tiny, tiny bit on the course, where that's involved. And I think remembering watching my mother and myself on days that weren't great, if we couldn't do a thing in one way, we adapted and learned to do it in a different way. And I think that's a great strength.
It comes back to what you were saying again about, it's this whole idea of the fluidity of the self, isn't it? And it often, when the mini deaths occur and we're grieving, it's because there's a moment of holding, there's a moment of resisting, or it's a moment of rigidity, which is very natural, completely natural. And I think it's something that many of us have to do. But there is a gift there as well of fluidity. If we can be fluid, if we can really, really let go, if we can really surrender to the process, then there is that flowing around, the creativity, the adaptation. It's all incredibly inspiring to see people do that and to experience people's flexibility in that way. It's very inspiring. But of course, it's not to set up a standard. That's not to become a burden. It's just an observation that, when we dig that deep and when we let go, when we accept that, many deaths are part of life, when we really get that, when we really practice that, and we start dying to the egoic self and taking it even further, then it's an absolute gift. It's a profound evolutionary gift.
And also not to be not to be flowery about it all, because, you know, I'm talking about creativity and I'm aware that some people could be thinking, well, yeah, great, but when it's bad, that's the least thing I think of. So not to expect yourself to be, oh, apparently I must be creative now and I must find wonderful ways to cope with this. But if it's a bad day, acknowledge that, and don't beat yourself up that, you know, you're not doing Tai Chi or you're not planting or you're not this, because it's observing other people and myself. It's just not being a harsh critic. So wherever you are in your stage, that's where you are. But the great thing about life is it will change. And sometimes it changes in ways you would prefer it not to. But sometimes it changes in ways you could never imagine.
Absolutely. And I've lost count of the number of people with chronic conditions who say that it's been their greatest transformer, their greatest teacher. And while they wouldn't wish it on anyone and they wish they didn't have it, they're kind of grateful for what they've learned and what they've begun. I certainly put myself in that camp. And I have to say the same for the processes of dying that I've been present at and witnessed. You know, I have always found being with a dying person to be a profound privilege, a deep, deep spiritual experience, an amazing moment of transition in their life, which is really quite extraordinary. So there's so much hidden in these things, but at the same time, we have to be really real about what we're really feeling and not feel that we should feel anything in particular, but actually just feel what we feel and allow ourselves to evolve in that process.
Yeah, and just don't judge yourself up against other people. Don't do the shoulds, shouldn'ts, mustn'ts. Really, really acknowledge where you are. And you're so right about, if you do work with people who are dying, or you actually are with a person when they're dying, I find it as profound as a birth. You know, it's elemental, isn't it, Anna? That you are a witness, but you're not in charge. And that's the thing with us while we're alive. We desperately want to feel in charge, and actually life is flowing through you. And of course you can try and shape things and make decisions, but there's something bigger going on. There's something elemental going on within you, both in illness and in health. And it is definitely profound, and it will, like you said, it will change. I think it changes you if you witness being with people who are approaching death, dying. And if you're ill yourself, hopefully you develop a compassion that you can't have if you haven't been through those experiences. And that's where the clash, that's where the frustration of an ill person or an elderly person or a dying person is. They're not speaking my language, but they can't, I'm not absolving them, but they can't speak your language till they've been part through that as well.
There is a kind of recognitional depth. When you've experienced something, then you kind of recognize when someone else is experiencing it, even though you know it might not be the same. But I guess what I'm hearing as well there is a good note to end on, because there's a kind of grace as life moves through us. And somehow trusting that for all the pain, all the fury, all the difficulty and all the glory of it, there is a grace as life moves through us. Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.